Hello, everyone. Wanted to give an overview today of Fantastic Four, Volume 1 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. So with us finally getting, at the least at the time of this video, Fantastic Four coming up in a few months for the MCU introduction, it made me really want to re-dive into just the Fantastic Four lore. I've read most of the modern runs of Fantastic Four, starting with Wade and Raringo, but I actually haven't read any of the classic material. So I picked up, so I'll be going through at least the Stan and Kirby run through Volume 4 before switching over to John Byrne's run. And I just wanted to kind of go through and kind of give my overview as this look back at the first family of Marvel. So as we see, we hit the classic Fantastic Four #1 cover here with the small text spine and I love that with these Omnibus collections, or at least for the classic ones, they put all the covers from that are collected on the inside. Just take over the dust jacket. So we have the Fantastic Four Omnibus, same small lettering. We have the full family here with the 4 on the back. And I'll go through here. There are going to be light spoilers here. So I'm going to give an overview of some of these stories, especially where we see like historically significant things occur. But I'll try not to spoil how storylines end or spoil too much for the story, so you're still getting enjoyment out of that. But there will be light spoilers, especially as far as like real world context of some of the stories that are taking place. So as we go through, so Volume 1 starts with collecting issues 1 through 30 and the first annual. And we see Stan Lee and Jack Kirby does most of it, but we have a variety of inkers and letterers. I do think it's interesting at this time that they didn't credit colorists at this time, but they seem to do a lot of work, so it's kind of disappointing that they weren't getting proper credit for their work. And throughout the book, you get various introductions or letters of reflection from some of the various collections. So for example, we have like the opening from the Marvel's Masterworks Volume 1 and Volume 2, as well as some other reflections from like Tom DeFalco and Roy Thomas, who would later go on to write some of the Fantastic Four after Lee and Kirby. And so this is kind of the start. So as you see, like the book starts, it goes from 1961 through 1964. And this is really the start of the modern Marvel era. So we know they had like their origins back in Timely Comics. Jack Kirby had been working for what would eventually become Marvel for a while and had left. But what's really interesting is just like Jack Kirby and some of these talking about reflecting on kind of the start of things, getting started. They knew with like the popularity, for example, of like Justice League, team books were really interesting. And they wanted to do something with the superhero genre, getting back, starting to get into the superhero genre. Because at the time, I believe they were doing a lot of like horror and monster books. And they talked about one of the things that made the Fantastic Four so special and so interesting is the fact that everyone didn't always get along. They weren't always super happy and super jolly. There was a lot of like internal tension, internal personalities. People had like actual personality types, what I thought was very interesting. So it starts off here with issue #1. And the very first villain that they go against is the Molecule Man. So at this point in time, Susan Storm, who we now know as the Invisible Woman, is Invisible Girl. And that will be something that happens throughout this run of like, this was very much still the 60s. So there is some language that may be, a lot of use of like female, and Susan Storm is characterized very much as like caring about her hair and retail. So that wasn't something that was like super, that was a little bit uncomfortable at times. It's actually not as heavy as I expected it to be, especially in the early on. I feel like it kind of comes on more later on as you continue to go, which is kind of strange. But I will say she's always at the forefront with the rest of the team. She's always taking place in the stories and engaged with the team activity. So we see sort of their origin. And some of the things that were really interesting here as you go through is just how, especially like how the art, how the thing was originally depicted. Of course, that his character model would go on to change quite significantly later on. I'm trying to see if I can just get a picture of how the drawing of him starts to change, especially like here, you start to actually see the eyes and such. And so they kind of start off right away, and you see that like, what I thought was interesting is how much of what we know and love of these characters were sort of present even right away. So like Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm kind of bickering a lot, going at one another. It also seemed weird that, but Ben sort of seemed to have like a love thing for Susan Storm at this time. So this is before they're Reed and Sue are married. They are just dating at this point, or have a history of feelings for one another. And what's interesting in this first issue is that you even get Ben Grimm sort of maybe having a thing for Sue Storm, and kind of having maybe a little bit of a jealousy with Reed happening, which is really different. So I think everyone knows the origin of the team. They get a rocket. Ben Grimm is sort of the pilot. They go into outer space where they're hit with the cosmic rays here, and they end up getting their powers. What I found interesting for a Silver Age book, I'm actually not really big into Silver Age stories, but this was all throughout this entire volume. It's very readable. It's not nearly as wordy and cumbersome to read as I was expecting. It wasn't a difficult read or a slog. So I thought that was a pleasant surprise. So they run into the Mole Man as their very first adventure as the team. What's interesting here also is as they're, fighting and doing their thing, is they're just wearing regular clothes. And Stanley talks about that in some of their letters of they didn't have costumes. They're just in their regular suits and their regular clothing. I thought that was fascinating. We won't go through every single page here, but just wanted to kind of give a sense of what how the stories start overall. So like issue 2, so we go from Mole Man to the Scrolls. The Scrolls are already introduced, and I think that's what's one of the most fun parts about this book is like seeing all the first introductions, where some of our classic villains come from. What was the context of meeting them? So we get like the Miracle Man. He's not a big villain in number 3 before we start to get to the real main antagonist, but starting in issue 3, we start to get letter pages. And I think this is a fascinating look to get what the reception of these books and of these teams were at the time. So just for example, and it's kind of revealed later that some of these names are like some fake letters that they kind of made up. I don't think all of them, but at least some of them were. I thought that was pretty interesting. But number 4, starting in issue 4, that's when we start to get some of our really classic villains, like the Submariner, Namor, who has started back in the 40s, but was sort of brought back as the main antagonist of the Fantastic Four. And throughout this book, yes, there's going to be a lot of doom, but really this book, volume 1, is all about the Fantastic Four versus the Submariner, and how that kicks off. And really early on, there's the love triangle between Namor, Reed, and Sue. And I always thought of that relationship, especially with modern Fantastic Four books, is that's a very, the attraction between Namor and Sue Storm is very one-directional. with Namor just sort of courting Sue, or being obsessed with her. But in these early stories, throughout this book, it is very not one-sided. Sue Storm has some very strong emotional feelings for Namor, so much so that even the writers in one of their letters says that they hadn't even decided yet that Sue was going to end up with Reed. They weren't sure if she was going to ultimately end up with Namor or Reed. And so that was just fascinating of how it's very different from the modern interpretation of that relationship. But here in the early stages, she has a really real soft spot for Namor that's sort of reciprocated on both sides. But she stays with Reed out of loyalty at this point. But issue 5 is when everything changes. We get the first appearance of Doctor Doom. This is probably the best villain in all of Marvel. We get the first appearance here in issue 5. And this is a fantastic story. We start to learn about he was almost a rival of Reed in college. And we get glimpses of his backstory. His backstory is going to get fleshed out much more. I think actually at the start of volume 2 is when we get the true origin of, or at least the original origin of Doom. But we do see glimpses here. So right away, his history is steeped in black magic and being in sorcery. And that is like the key difference between him and Reed, is that he is not pure science. Also in this first story, I think is also fascinating is we right away get his time machine. This is going to be sort of a recurring, I won't say theme, but subject matter throughout the story is the fact that he invented this time machine. And we'll come back to it. We'll see that back to it later on. So we end up having, so we go from Namor to Doctor Doom and Namor teaming up and being together. We just kind of skip forward. Puppet Master issue 8. This is where we first meet Alicia Masters, and Ben Grimm sort of starting the courting of that relationship between the two. Also, I'll just go back real quick. Issue 5, the introduction of Dr. Doom. This is also where we get the first letter from Roy Thomas, who will go on to be, pretty huge and influential at Marvel. And it's just interesting to see that he wrote in a letter in one of the very first, most influential issues of the Fantastic Four, and he'll go on to be able to write it later. So we're going to see throughout this book, and we'll just start a kind of flip. We get the introduction of Alicia, like we talked about. Doctor Doom and Namor appear a lot in this book. It seems like one of them appears every 2 issues or so. So it did, like, as much as they are the most interesting villains by far in the book, it did start to become like, okay, they're going back to that well quite often. I'll stop for a second here just to talk about the Impossible Man. Now, this is an alien that can basically do anything, and it completely outclasses the Fantastic Four in all of their abilities, and they can't just physically stop him. So Reed has to get creative with how they end the threat of him. What I thought was interesting, because I don't think we ended up seeing him for like another 10 years or so, and it's because the letter pages and they talk about this in some of the reflection letters. People hated the Impossible Man, and like they were getting calls nonstop. They were getting flooded with letters. There was just a complete hatred of this character, which I thought he was fine. He wasn't amazing, but I didn't think it warranted the hate. But then the other major piece of this book, and it's only like 2 stories, but it's pretty significant, is we get the Hulk. So we see there's like an Easter egg of a Hulk comic book earlier that Johnny Storm is reading, but now we get the Fantastic Four meets the Hulk, and we do get some, Thing versus Hulk skirmishes. I won't spoil how that goes, but I'll call it more of a skirmish than like the full fight. But early on, it's pretty established that the Hulk is, without question, always meant to be much stronger than the Thing, but that was their first tussle in issue 12. We get the Red Ghost and the Mad Thinker as their first appearances. Those stories were good, not the best of the issues. Though we do get the Watcher in some of these early issues. We see the first introduction with the Watcher, which is going to go on to be really important. So Doom comes back. But then we get the Fantastic Four annual #1. Now, up to this point, they've been kind of going back and forth with tussling with Namor and him threatening the surface world. But this is where we get the Submariner versus the human race. Namor has reunited with his race of Atlanteans, and they are finally sieging the surface. It has been hinted at a lot and building to this point quite a bit. This was a really fantastic story and felt like some good payoff. This isn't the last we see of Namor here, but this was a really pivotal point that we had been building to, and it was a really satisfying story. I won't go into how that ends. The artwork from Jack Kirby is fantastic. It's interesting in some of the letters to read how there were some mixed opinions of his art back at the time. Now we think of Kirby as the king, the master, right? One of the greatest artists ever, which I think this art is fantastic. But it's interesting to see in some of the letters that people, will periodically complain about some of the art. Later on, it becomes more positive, but early on, to get that feedback was sort of weird to see. So we get a lot of stories here with Dr. Doom sort of coming back. I wanted to stop on issue 19 though, because this was really one of the best stories that we had. We get their introduction with the Spider-Man, where Spider-Man thinking if he joins the Fantastic Four, he'll be able to get some money, but to try out for the team, he's gonna take them on and show them that he can kind of fight them and outclass them and show his skills. So this was not a full issue. This is expanded from a previous publication, which was only 2 pages. But this is really interesting to see Spider-Man versus the Fantastic Four. Is a fun, little side story. But issue 19 is one of my favorites. This is the introduction of Kang the Conqueror, or Rama Tut at the time. He's from the future. They're trying to find a cure for Alicia's blindness, and Reed stumbles upon, goes to Dr. Doom's time machine to go back in time, and they meet Rama Tut. And from the very start, it's pretty much established that Rama Tut is at the very least a descendant of Dr. Doom, because Rama Tut is he used his ancestors' time machine. And through this story, or previously, it's well established that Dr. Doom is the one who discovered time travel. So they established pretty early that Rama Tut is related to Dr. Doom. And this story is fantastic. And we're going to see him more, especially in volume 2. We get the first introduction of Hate Monger, where they actually started to deal with real world issues and hatred. And that's what made this story so good, is that this is a real family. This is a real team. They're dealing with real, I won't say real issues. I don't want to say that that's a recurring theme, because it's still very in fantasy, but they start to deal with real personalities and real personality traits versus all the, by golly and super happy depictions of superheroes of this era. We'll kind of save some of this. We'll just kind of skip forward. But I will just want to talk about this particular issue. This start of issues, at least, is the Hulk versus the Thing. And I take it back. While I love the Rama Tut story, I think this is actually the best. This is where we get a full-length fight between the Fantastic Four, mostly the Thing, and the Hulk. And really, this is I would actually strongly recommend stopping at 25 and starting Avengers, particularly Avengers 1 through maybe the first couple of pages of 4, but especially Avengers 1 through 4, checking out, because that's where we get the introduction of the Avengers in this conflict with the Hulk that almost starts from the beginning. The first 3 issues has some kind of conflict with the Hulk. The Hulk ends up joining with Namor to go after the Avengers and attack the Avengers. He's very much an antagonist at this point. And that is critical context for this story because it's a continuation of what happened there. And so the Hulk is on a rampage. He has to be stopped. So now the Fantastic Four. So we get the full Avengers are now here. But now it's time for the Fantastic Four to take on Hulk. And this story is incredible. It is, especially Ben Grimm. My respect for Ben Grimm grew 1,000-fold through the story. You just see the hearts and the guts. Because remember, it's really clearly established how much stronger the Hulk is than the Thing. But you just see the hearts, the guts, as all the other Fantastic Four are out for the count pretty quickly. The Thing is just maintaining and trying to protect the city. And this is just a drag-out fight, which is incredible. And it actually is the first 2-part story because now the Avengers join in. And it takes the combined collaboration of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four to go against the Hulk, which just shows how insane the Hulk was at this point in time. This story is fantastic. We come back to we get the introduction of the of the X-Men, sort of crossing over with the Fantastic Four. Didn't care for this story too much, but it is interesting to see the early X-Men. This is pre-Claremont interact with the Fantastic Four. So it's interesting to see from a historical view, but it's not a great story. And I would say the rest of this is kind of a step down from some of the amazing stories we got earlier, but that's about it. We get, again, these introductions, which gives some fantastic context to some of the stories, some of the receptions that we had at the time, the behind the scenes of how things came to be. I thought these stories were, getting this behind the scenes insight was fantastic. We get some scripts, but very light on the extras, like extremely light. But that is all for Fantastic Four Volume 1. This was fantastic. I am not a Silver Age book reader. I don't particularly care for the old school. I call it more modern comics starting, let's call it 2000 and later. But this was a fantastic read. And even going to read those issues, those early issues of Avengers were really fantastic. I actually resonated quite well with Stan Lee's writing style, and Jack Kirby's art, I think, is just phenomenal. So that's all for this one. I'm going to continue with reading Volume 2 and continue this march to reading all the old school Fantastic Four in the lead up to the movie that will maybe already be out by the time you see this, or if you're seeing this in the future. But that's it. Thank you.